हरिः ओम् श्रीगुरुभ्यो नमः। हरिः ओम् सदाशिवसमारम्भां शङ्कराचार्यमध्यमाम् अस्मदाचार्यपर्यन्तां वन्दे गुरुपरम्पराम् ॐ. Welcome everyone. This is the third session of Essentials of Dharma, and this series was started with the intention of educating Hindus more about their dharmic practices and the cultural moorings that they are usually unfamiliar with. I guess with that introduction, we can get into the modules that we are about to cover in the next few sessions. So we've already done establishing identity and loss in translation in the first two modules, and today we'll be doing debunking myths part one. So which is myths that outsiders have about us. So let's start with the third one. Module 3, debunking myths, part one, that outsiders have. So oftentimes we've seen that Westerners look upon us with curiosity and sometimes even with contempt, especially with the pop cultural references that exist about Sanatana Dharma. Things that you would watch on television. For instance, this is a shot from the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark. That's an Indiana Jones film. In the second movie, it was shot in India, the second movie, which was called Temple of Doom. And that showed India as a very backward nation with people who are almost like witch doctors. And so they would show people who are tribals worshipping goddess Kali with blood. So human sacrifices were shown as a intrinsic part of Sanatana Dharma, and there was a platter spread out for dinner, and they show that Hindus eat human brains, like monkey brains, human brains, lizards, frogs, tortoises, all these kinds of like exotic creatures. So such popular misconceptions need to be addressed because this is the view that Americans literally have of us. Not everybody, because now since we've come together as a smaller world due to the IT revolution and technology connecting us in a intimate way, nonetheless, some of these ideas still linger around in the minds of many Americans, and often the popular cultural representation that kids, especially in school-going kids in US, are exposed to are of a very exotic India. And as Rajiv Malhotra ji says, the cow, caste, and curry paradigm has to be broken. And so we'll be looking at some of these misconceptions that exist about Sanatana Dharma. So the first one, the big one, is are Hindus idol worshippers? So, I would request some participation over here. And what are your thoughts on this?
Prashant, it is actually the answer is both yes and no. Yes, because all these folks cannot imagine that the universe as one. So to get our focus towards the subject, we have that Utsav Murti and all those stuff placed. So primarily, but if you go to the higher level, I don't think idols are there.
That's actually very correct, and that's what we'll be covering. So that's the right answer. I also wanted to introduce an additional point, and which is the motivation. So many Hindus, they declare that we are not idol worshippers in order to fit into Abrahamic universalism. We all know that the big three faiths, which we call the monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they are completely against idol worship. In fact, they uh, did their best in order to destroy the idols wherever they could find them in their, whether you call it the Crusades or the Islamic conquest or whatever. Wherever they would see idols, they would want to destroy it, especially Muslims, because they have some kind of allergy against people who worship idols or have different beliefs, to be more precise. And so many Hindus have this tendency that, I think everyone's aware of Zakir Naik, right? So about 10 years back, he became a huge figure, especially in Bombay. And he would give these vast public talks, and he would talk about how Sanatana Dharma is very similar to Islam and how we worship a formless God, they worship a formless God, and things like that. And so he brought about a false equivalence between Hindus and Muslims in terms of philosophy. And he also mentioned that Islam is the newer version for the contemporary world. And therefore, his analogy was that if you have Windows 98 and if you have Windows 2000, obviously you're going to use Windows 2000. Therefore, it makes more sense to adopt Islam just because it's newer and it's more updated for our contemporary society. And so, an oft quoted verse is from the Yajurveda, which says, "Na tasya pratima asti." So, Ishvara, Brahman here does not have a form. And therefore, he says that it is the same declaration made in the Quran. And therefore, Hindus should not be worshipping idols. This was basically his attempt to digest Hindus into the Abrahamic or here Islamic paradigm, which is to do away with idol worship. And so this insecurity exists amongst a lot of Hindus, and that's what he was playing upon, that Hindus want to fit in. They want to be part of the universal bandwagon, so to speak. And so that's why many Hindus reject idol worship and they say that, sorry, we're not idol worshippers, we pray the formless God. And I think this is a deep insecurity which needs to be removed. So that is the first point. The motivation really matters. If the motivation of Hindus to declare that they are not idol worshippers is in order to fit in, then I think it's a wrong idea. And I would argue that yes, we are idol worshippers. Just to play devil's advocate over here. And honestly, if Hindus wish to worship Ishvara in the form of an idol, why not? Depending on the level of bhakti that is suiting an individual, this could be seen as a variation of Ekarupa bhakti. So we've studied in Vedanta that there are three grades of bhaktis. You have Ekarupa bhakti, you have Anekarupa bhakti, and you have Arupa bhakti. So Ekarupa bhakti is where you're fixated upon a form and you treat the form as Ishvaraha. It could be in the form of Krishna, it could be Rama, it could be anybody. And that form for you is Ishvara. And there's a difference between Jiva, Jagat and Ishvara in that form of bhakti. The next form of bhakti is Aneka Rupa bhakti, where the distinction between Jagat and Ishvara falls apart. And now there's a difference only between Jiva and Ishvara. The Jagat is a totality. All that there is around you is only Ishvara, but you are still separate from it. And finally, in Arupa bhakti, and I want to make this very clear, Arupa bhakti is not the same as worshipping Allah or worshipping a formless God. In fact, in Arupa bhakti, there is no distinction between the Jiva, between Jagat and between Ishvara. And therefore, that which sustains all names and forms is the one which is beyond names and forms. So Ishvaraha is not formless. Rather, Ishvaraha is beyond names and forms, and yet every single name and form itself is Ishvaraha. And so that is an understanding which is very different from what most Hindus would have you believe about Ishvara being formless as such. So that we'll probably see that in the next slide. And are Hindus idol worshippers? So taking the other standpoint, no, we aren't. From a differing standpoint, the same Vigraha or Murti, now we are replacing the word idol, can represent various principles that Ishvara stands for. So through different symbolisms that we have in a given Murti, it represents different aspects of Ishvara, different aspects of this totality. Here, while worshipping, the Bhakta does not merely confine Ishvara to the particular form, but uses it to invoke the whole. So we'll see what this is. Now, if you want to call someone to attention, you do so simply by tapping their shoulder, and their entire being is invoked. You don't need to touch their whole body, right, to call them to attention. You just need to tap them on the shoulder. So similarly, the limitless Ishvara may be worshipped or invoked through a limited form, because when everything that is there is only Ishvara, you can use any given form, any given word, symbolism, whatever it is, in order to invoke the whole. And when we talk about the whole, we are talking about the totality. Everything that exists, all that there is, you talk about space, time, matter, energy, life, whatever there is only Ishvara. There's nothing other than Ishvara. And this is what the Upanishads declare. Ishavasya midam sarvam. This is from the Ishavasya Upanishad, the first verse. And so why exclude the Murti? If everything is Ishvara, why exclude the Murti? And so there's nothing wrong in praying to the Murti. In fact, it's encouraged. And at the same time, the Murti alone is not Ishvara, but all that there is, including the Murti, is Ishvara. And we are using the Murti apart to invoke the whole. And ultimately, of course, Hindus are not idol worshippers, but just don't get bullied into saying so in order to conform with Abrahamic monotheism. So let this declaration that we are not idol worshippers come from understanding, not from pressure. So I thought, we just do a little exercise. Here's a Vigraha of Dakshinamurti Bhagwan. Would anyone care to spot the symbolism that they see in this picture? So we see the four arms of Dakshinamurti Bhagwan, right? Here on the right side, you can see he's holding fire, and then There's one hand which is in the Chin Mudra. The Chin Mudra is where you have the thumb and the four fingers touching, and that represents Jivatma Paramatma Aikyam. So it's basically Tattvamasi in Mudra form. Then if you see the element fire is represented, the water is represented because Ganga flows through the hair of Shiva Bhagavan. You see there's a crescent moon on the top right, and so the moon represents time, and so Ishvara has a lot of time. And the bandana that is wrapping the hair represents the air principle, Vayu. Uh, you see there's a demon right at the bottom. Does anybody know the symbolism of that demon that Bhagwan is stepping upon? So the demon represents ignorance, and here specifically self-ignorance. And Bhagwan being the very giver of knowledge, the first in line of our great teachers, Dakshinamurti Bhagwan, is the one who, by stepping upon self-ignorance, is the master of his very self. Because once you have gained knowledge of the self, you are the master of the universe. You are the universe. You know that you are non-different from Ishvara. And this same teaching is passed on to every Shishya. And the Shishya becomes an eventual guru and passes on to his Shishya and so on. And so the whole point that's being made over here is that any Vigraha we see has a lot of symbolism and it stands for many different things. And therefore, it's a good thing to invoke these different symbolisms through a Vigraha, and it's a nice way to worship Ishvara and remember the various things that he stands for. Right. So, can anyone tell me what this looks like? Come on, let's have some participation. Otherwise, it just can't be me talking. Okay, I'll give you a hint here. Aryans invading India.
Looks like the Alexander's army.
Yeah, exactly. So that's on the next slide. Okay, so I cheated a little. These are actually Greek hoplites. I hear
Okay.
the echo. Somebody can mute. I couldn't find a rendering of invading Aryans because they didn't exist, and that's the whole point. There's no such thing as invading Aryans. They never existed. Nobody invaded us, and therefore this was the best rendering I could find, which is of Greeks. So that was a joke. So the myth, Aryans invaded India, and the fact is that no such invasion took place. And this is going to be a big thing that we're going to be covering today. It'll take some time as well, and we'll debunk it in entirety before we're done. So the theory was first propounded by Mortimer Wheeler, and the statement is that Aryans came in from the north. These people who came to India from the northern hemisphere overthrew the natives, the original peoples who had settled. And these settlers had also built civilizations like Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Lothal, and so on. And so the people who came in from the north invaded us, or invaded the original settlers, and drove them away. And it also further postulates that the Vedas, Sanskrit, Ayurveda, Yoga, whatever it is, whatever we cherish and whatever we hold dear to us, what we call our culture, was brought to India by outsiders. And before we dismiss this theory, let's understand the motivations behind concocting it in the first place. Because clearly, coming up with the Aryan invasion theory took a lot of time, research, effort on part of the British and Germans as well. So there has to be some good reason for it. They wouldn't just invest a lot of time, money, and manpower into establishing a theory unless it profited them in some way, right? So we have to look at the different motivations. Can anybody tell me what they think are the motivations that the Britishers would have had to put forward such a theory?
I guess it was just the implementation of the Macaulay idea that anything that is original to the native people is somehow inferior to what the Britishers and the outsiders are bringing into the place.
Absolutely, absolutely. So that's one of the motivations. Any other? Okay, we'll look at it on the next page. So the Aryan invasion theory, or the AIT, took root during the colonial era, when India still had not gained her independence from the British. Along with deftly implementing divide and rule, the British were also experts at undermining the grand traditions of Indians in order to diminish their confidence and cultural solidarity. So this is exactly what you just said right now. Um, they've even tried to eradicate our entire education system quite successfully, which they are probably proud of. And our Gurukula system was completely uprooted by them. And this is another one of the facets of divide and rule, where they try to um, draw a distinction between the native, so-called native Indians, who they termed as Dravidians, and the Aryans who invaded from the north. And once you undermine somebody's culture and you break their, cultural confidence and solidarity, it's very easy to pick the pieces apart, and that's exactly what they wanted to achieve from this. And they suggested that just as in the past, Aryans, who were the ancestors of present-day Indians, displaced the original inhabitants, the British were simply returning the favor by repeating history. And see, this is a very clever trick. The Britishers said that you Aryans invaded Indians in the past, the natives who used to live here. And we are simply doing the same thing. So what is wrong with that? They are justifying their own invasion by propounding that, Aryans have invaded India. And so one can see what a clever ruse this is. And thus, in one fell swoop, in a single shot, not only did they misattribute authorship of India's rich cultural, historical past and ancestry to outsiders, but they also justify their own invasion. A very brilliant move on their part, and very treacherous as well for us. So this is important, right? They basically glorify the Aryans for bringing everything that we hold dear to us: yoga, Ayurveda, Vedas, Sanskrit, everything. And it also helped them justify their own vision, because they said, you've done it once, we are only doing it again, so what's the big deal over here? So as new evidence was being discovered, it all pointed against the Aryan invasion theory. It was slowly getting debunked, and the gatekeepers of academia, the sepoys in India and other parties with vested interests, knew that this theory would no longer hold up to the rigors of scientific and academic scrutiny. They had to do something, and fast. Aryan invasion theory was not holding water. They had to find a way to modify it, and therefore they came up with the Aryan migration theory, the AMT, because the Aryan invasion theory was not really a very sound one to begin with. So the Aryan migration theory is nothing but a sophisticated repackaging of the Aryan invasion theory, and it's promoted by the same people for the same reasons. They still have vested interests. And this theory states that Aryans did not invade India, but they migrated there. So now they've changed their game, so to speak. So here's a Pura Pakshi. So let's be honest here, a migration did take place, right? So what is everyone's thought on this? Was there a migration? Okay, let's look at it. Yes, so migration did take place, but it wasn't by the Aryans, the so-called Aryans who migrated. And we'll see it in the next few slides. That's why I just added a little color here, because I thought it's better. So we'll keep upgrading our presentation style every time we move forward. Okay. Before we further look into the Aryan migration theory, we'll take a slight detour into understanding more about this grand river. So, anyone familiar with Saraswati?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you share some what you know about it?
No, I know it's the river does not exist, and there's an effort by the current government to to actually refine the origins of the river.
Okay, so the river does exist, but it is only underground at this point. And there's a clear demarcation of the river bed. So anytime a river has flown through an area, you can see it. You can see it through archaeological records, and you can also see it from satellite imagery. And so the river existed at one point, and now it has become, it's dried up basically. And so yes, you're right. The government, I think in Haryana and other places, they are trying to um, do some more research about this, and hopefully in some places the river has actually sprouted from underground. So we are very happy about that. It's a new turn in our current century. Saraswati was the chief river of the Vedas, and it's praised lavishly in the Rig Veda as the best of all rivers. So one verse says, Ambi Tame, Nadi Tame, Devi Tame, Saraswati. Best mother, best river, best goddess. So this is from the Rig Veda. And these are some of the other verses which refer to the Saraswati in the Rig Veda as well. And so we'll look at why the discovery of Saraswati is a blow towards debunking all these Aryan invasion and migration theories. It's one of the daggers in the coffin. So it's very important that we understand about the Saraswati. Saraswati flowed from the Himalayas to the Arabian Sea via Dwaraka in Gujarat. The banks of Saraswati were home to many of our Vaidika rishis. The river dried up around 4000 BC. So that's 6000 years ago. The Mahabharata, around 3100 BC, also describes Saraswati's drying up. For perspective, the Indus Valley civilization lasted from 3300 BC to 1300 BC. And this is important too, right? Because the Britishers say that during the Indian Indus Valley civilization, which is Harappa, Mohenjo-daro and so on, the Vedas did not exist. This is their postulate. And therefore, but over here, the Saraswati we know has dried up 6000 years ago, which is incidentally older than many Christians believe the universe is. I guess people know that, right? That many Christians believe the universe is only 6000 years old. But anyway, if the river dried up in 4000 BC, it obviously predated the Indus Valley civilization. And the Mahabharata also, which is dated at 3100 BC historically, has references of Saraswati drying up. So the Purvapakshi says, okay, it's a good point. As Hindus, should we stop using Christian denotations, AD, which is Anno Domini, the Latin for year of our Lord, and BC, which is before Christ? And he's right. So it's better to follow the CE or BC notation. So CE stands for Common Era in place of AD, and BCE stands for before Common Era instead of before Christ, because why should we care, right? So anyway, it's even better to use the Vikram Samvat calendar, but let's make a small change right now. There we go. So BCE is better than BC, and this is more secular than being at least Abrahamic. Though eventually we should turn dharmic as well and start learning to use the Indian calendar. Any questions here so far on the dates? Okay, I guess we're good. So rivers were fundamental to the sustenance of all ancient civilizations. With the Saraswati and its tributaries receding into the ground, the people had to look for another home, obviously. Like rivers were the foundation ground for any culture to be built around. This led them to migrate further east towards the river Ganga. And this is so important to understand that the migration was our own people moving from Saraswati to Ganga. It was not Aryans migrating from the north. It was us moving towards the east. That was the migration, which thereby became the primary river of the Vaidika people, as evidenced in Itihasas and other writings. So there's a huge shift here, right? During the Vedic period, Saraswati was the chief river, the prime river. And if you read the Itihasas, the Puranas and so on, Ganga became the primary river. And there's a lot of mention of Ganga even today because of course it's flowing and it's in abundance. The waters are blessing the entire region over there. So it has formed a beautiful fertile zone even for agriculture. And of course, if you go to Haridwar and places, it's worshipped over there. People perform Ganga Aarti in Rishikesh as well. In fact, our Swami Dayananda ashram is based at the banks of the river Ganga. So this is why Ganga has gained prominence in the last few thousand years, because the Saraswati dried up. Therefore, the great migration that occurred in India was not of the imaginary Aryan tribes from the north, but Indians themselves moving from Saraswati to Ganga. This was the migration. So the Purvapakshi says, but the word Aryans surely has some meaning in Sanskrit, right? So participation here, what do you think the word Aryan means then? Because it's a word that we use in Sanskrit. So any person of noble character or background is referred to as Aryan. One who is ignoble was referred to as an Aryan. So Bhagavad Gita chapter 2 verse 2 says, there's a portion where it says, Anarya Jushtam Asvargyam Kirti Karam Arjuna. So Krishna Bhagavan is basically chiding Arjuna that, don't act in this ignoble manner, and your actions are not worthy of Swarga, because, Arjuna at this point wants to back off from the war, and he doesn't want to fight because of his attachment towards his family. And therefore, he's letting him know that your actions are ignoble and they are not worthy of the heavens. So this is the meaning of Aryan. Aryan means noble, and Anaryan means ignoble. And many times even the Pandavas were called Aryaputra, right? Throughout the Mahabharata. Aryaputra means the son of noble people. And Pandu was, of course, a very noble person. So before we proceed, any questions so far or comments?
Prashantji, I have one comment.
Yeah.
It seems that when Ravana's body was brought to the palace, Mandodari said, "Hey Aryaputra." So it was way ahead of even Mahabharata. Arya means somebody with a noble character.
Good point. I did not know that. Thank you for letting me know. So that also tells us that Aryan is a word that's in Sanskrit, and as you said, it was even used in Ramayana, which is predating the Mahabharata. So it has nothing to do with the race. Aryan has to do with nobility.
Yeah, and this was in Sri Lanka, current Sri Lanka, not even India.
Yeah. So that time it was all part of Bharatvarsha. So as we talk about Akhanda Bharata, so Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, Burma, Nepal, all of this was part of India. So this is the Saraswati River. We see it flowing through Bharat, or rather the dry riverbed of the Saraswati in blue. So the conclusion that Aryan invasion theory and Aryan migration theory happened are both myths. I thought I'll just put this GIF because I really like it. Aryan invasion myth busted. This is from the movie 300, by the way. Okay, so Vedas underwent changes over time. And the fact is, this is a myth. And the fact is that Vedas are time invariant. So the Vaidika mantras were passed down through a Shrauta Parampara, an oral tradition from Guru to Shishya. It is important to understand that the mantras of the Vedas remained absolutely unadulterated over their entire history. So many people say that the Vedas have changed over time, right? Because everything changes over time. Therefore, why not the Vedas as well? So this is what we'll try to explore over here. This was achieved by a meticulous training that every student undergoes at a Veda Pathshala. Everyone has played Chinese Whisper as children, right? Or is there somebody who hasn't? I'm going to assume that we all have. Your experiences will verify that when the word returns back to you, it is very different from the one that was initially passed on. With the Vaidika mantras too being passed orally, a doubt may arise whether, like Chinese Whisper, they are also subject to modifications over extended periods of time, right? So my question to the group would be, why do you think that Vedic mantras were not subject to this sort of modification and that they've remained unchanged? Like Chinese Whisper, if the guru passes on the mantras to the Shishya, what is the guarantee that his Shishya will reproduce it exactly the same?
Because I've heard that the Vedic mantras, they were taught one way and then the other way, in the reverse manner also to each student. So that they would be, from one generation to another, be passed on exactly in the same way.
That's very correct. That's absolutely correct. In fact, there were many other methodologies that were also used, and that's what we'll look. You're right about that. So luckily for us, the methodologies implemented in learning the Vedas are rigorous and circumvent any such potential errors that might otherwise creep in. These memorization styles are developed to aid in the immaculate reproduction of the mantras even after n generations. So no matter how far down you go, the Vedic mantras will always be reproduced exactly the same. So we'll take a look at a few of the memorization styles over here. So there are 11 of them: Samhita, Pada, Krama, Jata, Mala, Shikha, Rekha, Dvaja, Danda, Ratha, and Kana. So the Jata Patha recitations: word 1, word 2, word 2, word 1. So this is like what Gunjanji said, right? You kind of like reversing the order. 1 2 2 1, 2 3 3 2, 2 3 3 2, 3 4 4 3, and so on. Then you have the Dvaja Patha. Word 1, 2, and then n minus 1 and word n, 2, 3, n minus 3 and n minus 2. And this is even more complex. I'm not even going to try it. I have a sample below, which I'll show you of Ganapata. Ganapata is word 1, word 2, word 2, word 1, word 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1, 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 3, 2, 2, 3, 4, 4, 3, 2. I'm not going to go further. But here's an example of the Ganapata of Pata of Gayatri. Just to, everyone knows the Gayatri mantra, right? So the Gayatri mantra is Om Bhur Bhuvasvaha Tat Savitur Varenyam Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi Dhiyo Yonah Prachodayat. And this is how it sounds in Ganapata. Recite the Gayatri mantra, it might take about 7-8 seconds, and the Ganapata of Gayatri mantra is almost 2 minutes long. So this is exactly what Gunjanji is saying, that you say it in so many different styles and different ways that it can be reproduced exactly the same no matter how far down in time you go. So these are the different teaching methodologies that you use in a Veda Pathshala. And a Veda Pathshala is where a student is initiated from a young age, preferably around, I think, 8 years, 7-8 years. And then they start learning the Vedas for a period of 12 years. So 12 entire years are spent for a firebrand student, not an ordinary guy, a genius. He has to be a very smart person to even learn one shaka of the Vedas completely. It's difficult to memorize it. And it takes 12 years to memorize one shaka of the Vedas. And there are 4. So, the Purvapakshi has a relevant doubt. Everything changes in time. Don't the Vedika mantras? And nope, the Vedika mantras are time invariant and cannot be dated using linguistics as a measure. So let's take a graph of any imaginary language, and let's look at the variation in time. So, you start with some variation, it increases, it continues to increase over time. Whereas if you look at the Vedika mantras over here, they are a straight line. That's it. No matter how far down you go in time, there will be no variation introduced into the Vedika mantras. So I've just introduced some different eras. This is maybe around the time of, I guess, the drying up of the Saraswati River, 4000 BCE. This is around the time of the Mahabharata. This is around, say, the time of Mahavir and Buddha. This is the time of Adi Shankaracharya, and so on, and up to the present. So there will be absolutely no variation in the Vedas. Any questions here so far before we move to the next topic? Okay, we'll.
Prashant, I just want to know whether the Vedas have been recorded as such as written documents now, or are we still in the memory and people stage?
Yeah, right now we are in both. So we have it recorded. I mean, recorded as in like it's been catalogued. All the Vedas are there for us, available in text format. And at the same time, the Guru Shishya Shrauta Parampara continues on. So there are still Veda Pathshalas. There are still people who know the entire Veda by heart, like the entire branch of the Vedas, like Rig Veda, Yajur Veda, Sama Veda, or Atharva Veda. There are definitely people who do, and this will continue on. So we don't want there to be any interruption in the Shrauta Parampara. We want that to continue, but also for matters of practicality, research, and scholarship, it makes sense to also catalog the same, just so that one can have it ready for reference. Otherwise, you would always have to go to a Panditaha to get verses and so on. So the Vedas also include the Upanishads, by the way, and so there are many Vedantins, some of whom especially have memorized, say, the Taittiriya Upanishad, and that is also used for chanting purposes. Okay, so the next myth is. Thank you. The next myth is Vedas were composed around 1900 BC. If you go to Wikipedia and places, you will find that there's always an origin date, and this is because of the Western obsession with linear time. They always, want to historically mark events, and they cannot proceed without that. So the fact is that an origin cannot be assigned to the Vedas. We cannot. We haven't been able to, and there's no way to clearly do it. Depending on the academic you speak to, the origin of the Vedas have been commonly proposed to have originated between, well, I'm using origin twice, sorry about that, between 1900 to 1700 BCE. This cannot be correct, since the Saraswati, which dried up in around 4000 BCE, still flowed at the time of the Vedas, which naturally makes them older, right? So if the Saraswati dried up 4,000 years, or sorry, 6,000 years back, and it has been mentioned in the Vedas as a great river, a grand river, and so on, then obviously the Vedas have to be older than the Saraswati, and therefore it cannot be 1900 or 1700 BCE. It has to be older than 4000 BC at least, at minimum. As concluded earlier, it is untenable to date the Vedas based on linguistic evidence, since it would necessitate tracing changes over time. And Vedas, as we saw in the previous section, being time invariant, are neither subject to these changes nor consequently for the study of these non-existent changes. So you can only study changes. But since the Vedas we see they have not changed over time linguistically, how can you study the changes? And therefore it's impossible to date it even based on an oral tradition. Now let's take English as a contrast. English has undergone substantial changes from the time of the composition of Beowulf to the Canterbury Tales and further up to the Shakespearean era leading to the present. So this is a passage from the epic Beowulf, which is written in Old English. On the left is Old English, on the right is the modern English translation of it. And you can see that you can't recognize the text at all. I have no idea what it means. Maybe there's one word which is similar, like over here, under and under. But none of the rest are like, you would definitely need a dictionary in order to read this epic. And this is probably about 14, sorry, around 1000 to 1500 years old. Not very old. So English has undergone tremendous changes and modifications over time. Many other non-linguistic dating methods still rely on disqualified conclusions shared by the Aryan invasion theory and thus are unreliable. So even if we move away from linguistic dating methods, the others rely on the Aryan invasion theory, and therefore you can't rely on it because Aryan invasion theory itself is false. Traditionally, we accept the knowledge contained within the Vedas, if not the words themselves, to be Anadi as well as Aparushya. Anadi is beginningless. It has no beginning in time. The knowledge itself cannot have a beginning, right? A common example I often use is if Newton, well, I won't say he discovered gravity because there are people in India also who have talked about gravity before him. But if Newton rediscovered gravity independently, he did not create it. The knowledge of gravity was not something he created. The law of gravity, you have the gravitational constant times the mass 1 times mass 2 divided by the radius or the distance square is not a fact that he created. It's something he only rediscovered. And therefore the knowledge of gravity is anadi. The laws are anadi. The formulae are also anadi in a sense. And similarly, the knowledge contained in the Vedas is also anadi. That I am my nature is satyam jnanam anantam, or this is the nature of karma, this is the nature of the jiva, and all of these things were not created by people. It has always existed. And therefore, if it's anadi, it is also aparushya. You cannot have something that's anadi and also paurushya. Paurushya means created by man. Aparushya means it is not the authorship of any individual. It is knowledge that has always existed. It is not authored by you. It is not fiction. It's not a story. It's not like Harry Potter that one day you sit in in Starbucks and start typing a story and come up with it through your imagination. The Vedic teachings are fact. They are the blueprint of the nature of reality, and the parampara is a way through which this teaching is passed down. So the knowledge is anadi and it is unauthored by mankind. Obviously, there would be a historical time when this knowledge was received, right? So while we say the knowledge itself is anadi, there is obviously a time when the knowledge was received by the Vedas. I mean, by the rishis, because the rishis were obviously born in time, but when exactly is not known to us yet. And maybe it should remain so because the real focus is the teachings contained therein, not the dating and so on. And this is a preoccupation of Westerners ever since they've come to India. And now even the sepoys in India, they are all into dating the Vedas. They are more focused on trying to find out how old the Vedas are as opposed to finding out what it contains and what the teachings are. So we have to move our focus away from these kind of scholarly pursuits. Though I wouldn't even call them scholarly. I would say it's a waste of time to try to assign a date to the Vedas. And we should focus on learning what they have to present because there's so much. A lifetime is not enough to know what the Vedas are. So that is my 2 cents on this. Any thoughts here before we close this section? Okay. So the first myth is Vedas change over time. Second myth is Vedas are composed around 1900 BCE. And so we busted both myths, and that's two birds with one stone. I'm enjoying these animations, by the way. So far, we've done the role of idol worship, or the lack of it, and we've covered the Aryan invasion theory and the Aryan migration theory, and we've debunked both of those as well, with the help of understanding more about Saraswati. And now we've gone over the Vedas changing over time and being composed around 1900 BC. So these are the myths we've covered so far.
Yeah, Prashanti, I think there's a misrepresentation of facts, wherein I see a lot of my friends, the Christians and some of these evangelists, who would come up to me and say that Manusmriti is a part of Vedas, wherein I said no, Manusmriti came thousands of centuries later on. It is not nothing to do with the Vedas.
You're right about that. Manusmriti is a Smriti, whereas Vedas are Shruti. So I think this would be a good opportunity to pull up let me pull another document up, and you'll find this particularly interesting. So this is something that we had gone over. Where is it? Here. We went over this last year in a set of presentations. Division of scriptures, and we'll just spend a couple of minutes here. So Shastram, the entire corpus of teachings that we have is what we call the Shastram. You have Shruti, the Vedas, which we talked about just right now. They are Aparushaya. They are not authored by man. Then you have Sutras, which are like Brahma Sutra, Griha Sutra, and so on. Then you have Smritis, such as Manu Smriti, Bhagavad Gita. So when you talk about Shruti or Vedas, you have Rig, Yajur, Sama, Atharva. And within each of the Vedas, you have Karma Kanda, Jnana Kanda. Within Karma Kanda, you have the mantras, Brahmanas, and Aryanika. And Jnana Kanda is basically the Upanishads of Vedanta. So the Shruti, which is the Vedas, are different from the Smriti. And therefore, you are absolutely right about that. That if your Western friends or Indian friends also are saying that the Smritis belong to the Vedas, it's not correct. The Smritis help one recollect the teachings of the Vedas. However, if there's a contradiction between the teachings of the Vedas and the teachings of the Shruti, the Smriti, then you have to go with the conclusion presented by the Vedas, or you have to modify or mold the conclusions of the Smritis to suit the conclusion of the Shruti. So suppose Manu Smriti might say something, one does not have to accept it blindly, because what we have to go by as the unauthored teaching are the Vedas. They are Aparushaya, and they are ultimately the received knowledge, the received wisdom that we have. But many people have also misrepresented the Manusmriti itself, the teachings contained therein. So there are many good teachings there too. And one has to understand that just as the Constitution of India today is not perfect, Manusmriti was also in a sense a constitution that was presenting the laws of India or Bharat at that time. And they are subject to change and modify. So everything in the Manusmriti need not be accepted today, and at the same time, everything in the Manusmriti need not also be rejected today. That is a mistake that people make. They find a few things in it which they don't like, and therefore they reject all of it, and that's also a problem. So, for example, Manusmriti says that speak what is true, and speak it sweetly, speak it nicely. If there is truth, don't. If there's something that you have to say which is true, don't say it bitterly. If there is something you have to say which is false, don't say that sweetly either. Only say things which are true and speak them sweetly. So these are good teachings that are there in the Manusmriti and other places too. So we have to know how to separate the things that we require from the things we don't, without condemning the entire scripture. So the grand myth, Vedic traditions is full of social evils, has a lot of sub-myths as well, which we'll see. Discriminating women, child marriage, caste system. Oops, aren't we missing someone? There's Sati. Sorry, had a late night. Okay, thanks. Alright, so let's look at these one by one. The caste system is discriminatory. That is a myth. And the fact is that Varna has nothing to do with caste. Before we get into Varna, what are your thoughts on Varna?
Uh, we had two things, Jati and Varna. Varna was the work that I do, and that gave me either to be a Brahmin or a Kshatriya or a Vaishya or a Shudra, right? Or am I jumbled up?
Close, you're close. So there are actually three things within Varna: Jati, Guna, and Karma.
Yeah. Okay.
But we'll see that on the next page. But yeah, close. So first, let's understand what the word caste means. The English word caste is derived from the from the Spanish or Portuguese casta, which can refer to several things ranging from race, breed, lineage, and so on. As we saw in our last module, this is another case of Indians unwittingly mapping their categories onto Western worlds, leading to a lot of confusion. So Varnam literally means color, and in our context, it indicates quality or attribute. Vyavastha, when we talk about the Varna Vyavastha, is accommodation, order. So the Varna Vyavastha is an ideal social infrastructure which allows for the growth of the individual, family, society in all the Purusharthas. So this is a scheme, a social scheme, if you may, to aid in the growth of the individual as well as the entire society in the fulfillment of their Purusharthas, which are Artha, Kama, Dharma, and Moksha. Or for us, Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha. In that order. So here is the classification as you just mentioned right now. You have Varna Vyavastha. You have four Varnas: Brahmanas, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras. Each of these Varnas have three components to them. You have Jati, which is based on your birth. You have Guna, which is what's important to us, especially as Vedantins, which is based on your attributes, your mental attributes, your quality, your way of thinking, the way you lead your life, and so on. And Karma, which are your actions. So, if we are going by Jati and Karma, there is no inferiority or superiority, none whatsoever. Regardless of what you are born as, it does not matter. Every human being, every creature is equal. If you talk about karma also, it doesn't matter, whether you are an engineer, you're a doctor, or you're serving French fries at McDonald's. It doesn't matter. As long as you do your actions with an attitude of karma yoga, you are, like doing the right thing. So karma and jati are not having any connotations of inferiority or superiority. Now, if you talk about guna, yes, certainly one can be inferior or superior based on the gunas. So a Brahmana, by guna, by attributes, has sattva, rajas, and tamas in that order, in terms of the preponderance of the gunas. So that a Brahman is sattva guna pradhana with a preponderance of rajas and then tamas. Kshatriya is a rajas guna pradhana with a dominance of sattva and tamas secondarily. Vaishya is a rajas guna pradhana with a secondary dominance of tamas and sattva. And a Shudra is a tamas guna pradhana with a dominance of rajas and sattva. So we'll not really go into too much detail over here, but each of these, everything in this jagat is composed of the three gunas. All that you talk about in terms of names and forms and attributes are all based on a combination or of these three gunas. So this is how we define the guna vibhaga. So there are three vibhagas for varna: jati vibhaga, which is based on birth; karma vibhaga, which is based on your profession. So if we talk about jati, is very self-explanatory. Whatever you're born as, if your parents are Brahmins, you're a Brahmin by jati. By karma, if you are a businessman, then you are a jati vaishya. Karma vaishya. If you are a teacher, whether you're teaching mathematics or you're teaching Vedas or you're teaching astronomy or whatever, then you're a Brahmana by karma. And if you are, say, a policeman, or you're a minister, or you're working in the administrative services, then you are a karma kshatriya. So you see that there's no role that is inferior or superior over here. In fact, most of the things that we do today, most people are Shudras in terms of karma. Because if you work in the service sector, if I'm an engineer, if somebody else is a doctor or a lawyer, as long as you are employed by somebody else, you are a karma Shudra. And there's nothing high or low about it. But unfortunately, the word Shudra has taken a negative connotation thanks to the Britishers and so on. So we need to address each of these points as we go ahead. Also, before we proceed, there's one verse. So this is from the Purusha Sukta. And a lot of non-Hindus and even some Hindus, or who would like to call themselves Hindus, have used this verse in order to show that there's discrimination between the different varnas. And this is incorrect in terms of being presented as discriminatory. That's because who said that any one body part is superior to the other? You cannot do much without the feet, you cannot do much without the head, you cannot do much without the arms or the stomach. You need all of these in order to sustain the body, right? Similarly, just as you need all limbs and all parts of the body to sustain the body, you need all the varnas in order to sustain society. And if the feet are unholy, guess what? We refer to Shankaracharya as Bhagavad Pada, the feet of the Lord. The feet of Bhagwan is what you call Bhagavad Pada. So we call Shankaracharya as the feet of the Lord, or foot, or I don't know how that grammatically works here, but that's the explanation over here. When you want to bow down to somebody, you touch their feet. If you bow down to your guru, you touch their feet. If you bow down to a murti, you touch the feet. You don't touch the head or the mouth or whatever, right? I mean, you can if you want, but usually it's a custom that you touch the feet. And so there's nothing unholy about the feet. If at all, it can be argued that the feet is the holy part of the body too, just as any other part of the body. And so this verse cannot be used to show that there's any discrimination, it's completely absurd. Okay, feel free to interrupt anytime in between. So now we've already gone over the Guna Vibhaga. Unfortunately, I covered it on the previous slide, so we don't need to spend much time here. So the caste system, again, going back to the history of Varna and practicality, division of labor. Everybody knows this. When Henry Ford started the Ford Motors and started manufacturing cars, he used the assembly line. And the assembly line is for the first time, or one of the first few noted times, when we use division of labor to a great advantage. And so you have an entire assembly line where the parts of the car are lined up and they move forward on this conveyor belt. And each worker does one thing. One person may put in the engine, the other person may paint, the third person would set up the gearbox, and so on. They would go down the assembly line and ultimately would have a final product, which is the car. And so this was division of labor, as opposed to everybody working on the same thing at the same time, which would just be chaos and jumble. It would turn things chaotic. And so division of labor is what really Varna does, right? You have the 4 different sections of society. You have the Brahmanas, the Kshatriyas, the Vaishyas, and Shudras. None of their duties overlap. None of them are repeating the same effort. None of them are doing the same thing that the other person does, and everybody is contributing something new to their society. And so division of labor is a tremendously helpful tool in order for us to prosper and to manufacture, to be efficient with whatever we do. And therefore division of labor was one of the hallmarks of Varna. Second is proportionate balance. So today also we have our own Varna Vyavastha in a sense, right? Even in the Western world we follow Varna Vyavastha, except that we don't give it the name. So you have people who are doctors, you still have people who are teachers, you have people who are blacksmiths and goldsmiths and jewelers and whatnot. Every kind of profession is there, and people do exist. They just don't have this kind of strict demarcation. But we don't have a proportionate balance, because today everybody wants to be a Vaishya. Let's face it. Everybody wants to own a business. Everybody wants to make a ton of money, and everybody wants to be in possession of wealth. And the balance is lost. So when you let the free market run loose, when you don't apply certain rules and regulations, I'm all for free market. I'm all for capitalism, but there has to be guided capitalism. It does not need to be blind. And therefore, if we see our profession today, you have the karma-based industries, the entertainment industry, where people are paid disproportionately high. These so-called seculars like Shah Rukh Khan and Amir Khan, when they make comments about India being intolerant, these are the same people that, I don't know, how much do they make per movie? 50-60 crores salary? More than that, right? Probably. They are making more in a single movie than most of us would make in like 10 lifetimes together. And this is disproportionate. But that is how the free market economy works. And I have no serious complaints against it. But what I'm saying is that at least a proportionate balance was maintained in society during the Vedic period, where everybody had their role to do and everybody was respected and everybody was paid their dues. You don't talk about inflation and things like that in a society where there is a better balance. Things are well proportioned. That's what I'm trying to say. So I find it absurd that a teacher in India teaching would make 25,000 rupees a month, whereas a cricketer like Sachin Tendulkar or this Virat Kohli fellow with tattoos all over, or somebody else, Shah Rukh Khan and all these people would make crores and crores of money just with it's
Simple
disproportionate. There's something
advertisement.
imbalanced over here. I find a problem in the way our society works. So the other thing is townships, right? In those days, today the world is well connected. We have the internet. I'm talking from the USA, and some people here are from India, somebody else maybe in Europe. I don't know, but people are well connected, and there is more. It's a smaller world because of the way we have globalized ourselves. In those days, most likely you would be born in the same village and you would die in the same village and you would never get out. There was very infrequent travel. Not everybody owned horses, and even if you owned horses, you would probably not like wander the whole country. And so there was infrequent travel, and therefore it made sense to like stay within the same town and to do the same things, and whatever your parents have done, you do the same thing, and you so on. Your kids will also end up doing the same things. So this also led to a somewhat of a balance in within the Varnas. There were no job applications, right? The Brahmin did say, hey, you know what, I am tired of teaching the Vedas. I want to go and fight in the army, and he would go and apply for a position in the army. He wouldn't do that in those days. So there was no such thing as job applications. There were fewer insecurities or unemployment. Everybody had a job. Today, imagine that we have a room over here of four people. Let's say there's one Brahmin, there's one Vaishya, there's one Shudra, and there's one Kshatriya, right? Four people are there. Now the Brahmin is tired of like studying the Vedas and teaching mathematics or whatever. And so he says, you know what? I want to become a businessman. And so he'll take up business, and now he'll split the profit of the Vaishya in half, because he'll make half the profit. The Vaishya will go out of business. Now he'll look for a job, but he's not qualified as a Brahmin because he doesn't have the qualifications. And so he'll be jobless. So that's how unemployment happens. I'm not saying that the free market society or capitalism is bad, but all I'm saying is there was a particular wisdom back then in the Vedic society why they followed the Varna Vyavastha, and it made a lot of sense. And if we look at the historical records, India was the highest producer of GDP in the entire world. I don't mean this as an exaggeration. By the 15th century or so, India had about 35 to 38% of the entire world's GDP. That's more than the US and Europe combined together. Way more. And it was followed by China, which had maybe like 32 or 33%. And the rest of the world, maybe like 30%. So India was very successful, and it shows. It had a successful society. We had great history of science and technology, literature, art, philosophy, whatever. Everything wonderful has originated in India, and it has, the fact that it has worked, the proof of the pudding is in the, eating of it. And therefore, the Varna Vyavastha is not as bad as people have made it out to be. And if you recall, it was a very fair thing as well. Doesn't even know the incident concerning Yudhishthira and his crowning when he was still a Yuvaraja, and the test that he was put through. Anyone? Okay, so there were four people who were co-criminals. They were all guilty of the same crime, which is of murder. One person was a Brahmin, the other a Kshatriya, third Vaishya, and fourth a Shudra. And the wise men in the court wanted to test Yudhishthira's Viveka, his discriminative prowess to understand dharma from adharma, or to be able to make decisions. And so they asked him that how should we punish these four people? Each of these four people killed this guy. They all were like just cohorts in crime. And so so Yudhishthira says that the Brahmana needs to be punished the most. And the reason for that is that he's an educated person. He has studied his whole life. There is no excuse that he has in terms of lack of knowledge or wisdom or whatever for committing such a crime. And therefore he is the guiltiest of all, because he should have been the one who was educating others not to perform such things. The Vedas teach ahimsa paramo dharma, that at least it's there in the Mahabharata as well. And therefore the Brahmin should have known better, and therefore he needs to be punished the most. The next in order of punishment should be the Kshatriya. The Kshatriya's job is to protect people, not hurt people. And though he is not as educated as a Brahmin, he still has the basic civic responsibilities to protect people and to protect lives and to know that this is wrong. And therefore the Kshatriya needs to be punished next in order of the severity of punishment. The Vaishya needs to be punished slightly lesser than the Kshatriya because he does not have the same civic responsibilities of the Kshatriya, nor does he have the same education of the Brahmin. But yet he is more familiar with these rules and laws of society than the Shudra. Therefore, the Vaishya is third. Now, the Shudra does not have the education of the Brahmin. He does not have the responsibilities of the Kshatriya, and he does not have perhaps the know-how, the cultural know-how as much as the Vaishya. Therefore, the Shudra needs to be punished the least. And so you see over here, when we talk about fairness, when we talk about equality, it's fairness. Equality does not mean that everybody needs to be treated exactly the same. It's about the fairness given the situation. So, if in modern terms, equality would be, having an elephant. This is a picture that I've seen somewhere, a photo. You have an elephant, you have a fish, you have a monkey, and you have a cat. And they are all given the same test, which is to climb the tree to show who's superior. Doesn't work out, right? Because equality is not about you doing the same things in the same way, but it's about you doing it in the way that is prescribed, that is expected of you. So if I'm an engineer, I cannot pass a medical test. Obviously, a doctor would fare better than I. So this is what I'm trying to explain. That in India, equality is about having the same rights. Whereas, in the Western world, equality is everybody having the same rights. Whereas in India, equality is about respecting everybody's individual duties. Everybody has a different duty to perform and to give equal respect to that particular person's duty, regardless of what it is. Whether you are a shoemaker or whether you are the top businessman of the country, doesn't matter.
Prashantji, I just have one question which could not be related to this. If this is the explanation, then why is intercaste marriage a problem? Why has that always been a problem?
So when we talk about, again, we have to break away from the word caste because we don't follow the caste system as such. But you see, there's something called Varna Sankara. And the duties of if you're a Brahmin, and again, things have laxed down, right? Because now we are living in a more globalized world, so it's not as rigid as it used to be, and it should not be that rigid also. And so when two different cultures intermingle, it may be an enriching experience, but at the same time, if there's not enough societal maturity, then there might also be confusion between what the child should follow, what should I follow, what should you follow, and so on. And so sometimes, okay, let's take an extreme example. Let's say a Hindu is there, very traditional Vedic Hindu who's grown up chanting the Vedas, and whose whole family is in a lineage of priests like pujaris, panditas. And now he falls in love with a Muslim. Again, I'm not against all of this. I'm just trying to contrast with an extreme example. Now, the Muslim is devoted towards worshipping Allah, which is again inconsistent with the teachings of the Vedas, whereas the Hindu is devoted to Ishvara, which is again very different from Allah. It's Ishvara Allah Teru Naam does not work for us. Okay, we are a little bit more educated than that, I hope. So we know that there's a difference. They don't accept the laws of karma, we do. They don't accept things such as rebirth, we do. They don't accept Tattvamasi, the conclusion that you are that, and we do. So there's a very we can give the other person the right to follow what they are following. But what will you teach your child? The mother will say that, I want to teach my child to worship Allah. And the father will say, okay, you teach him to worship Allah, I'll teach him to worship Ishvara. But ultimately the child will get confused because if both of them are true to their tradition, they cannot but disagree with each other. They cannot but disagree. The person, if they have read, hopefully, if both of them are educated people, they have to see that there is inconsistencies between the teachings. So one teaching has to either be dominant in the upbringing of the child, or the child will be taught both things and ultimately will get confused because he will not know what to choose, he or she or whoever. So what I'm really trying to say is that in those days, especially, this was an extreme example, but in those days, when you intermingle between different varnas, your family traditions start breaking down, and the next generation does not know what to follow. Because a son of or a daughter of a Kshatriya and a Brahmin, or a Kshatriya and a Shudra or whatever, will not know which duties to follow, right? Because the Jati Varna is violated over there and they will not know what they should do. And again, it will create this whole issue that we have seen, such as job applications and so on, right? You see what I'm saying? So life was simpler back then. People did not ask too many questions, not because they were not allowed to, but because they did not feel the need to. If you live a life of Karma Yoga and you follow certain laws that are prescribed in society and so on, prescribed by your kingship, prescribed by the social atmosphere, then people followed it as as Ishwara's prasad. That this is what I'm born into. My father's a blacksmith, I'll be a blacksmith. What's wrong with that? My father's a farmer, I'll be a farmer. My father's a soldier, I'll be a soldier. All of these things were followed to a certain degree without asking too many questions because people were satisfied karma yogis. This it's almost a disease today that we fight for rights, we fight for equality, but we don't know what rights are and we don't know what equality is, because we say equality means everybody should be doing the same thing, whereas equality in our way of understanding is fairness. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but it was an extreme example I gave.
Okay, I would like to make a point here.
Yeah.
In what India was, according to even whether Swamiji has also mentioned that India was a Dharmic society without competition. Nowadays, we all compete for a certain job. We are all aware of the engineering drive in just a few years back in India. Everybody was going for engineering. Parents were pushing their children for engineering. Similarly, we never had such a competition in Hindu India. What you learn from what your father does, you also do. Similarly, every child follows his father. Right from birth, he is seeing his father do whatever their family profession is. This is being followed, and this actually helps in being experts in that profession.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so such a competitionless society, everybody will be doing their duties. We were not a society that concentrates on right. I have right for that. I have right for, as Western society and Westernized India, even in India today,
Yes.
everybody is thinking about rights. We were more bothered about duties. What our dharma is. What should we do?
Yes.
When everybody does his duty, normally everyone gets his right also. When I do my duty as a citizen, as a son, as a father, and in every role I am playing in life, that actually that's more, in my opinion, that's better than going after this rights, demanding this right, that right. Better than that is let's all do our duty. So India was such a
agree with that, and that is true. So, as you said, Shamabai said, we Hindus traditionally were a rights-based society versus what the West, oh, sorry, we were a duty-based society versus a rights-based society that we see today. But the other thing is that we have to also understand the cultural context. Today, we've all grown up watching television, we've all used the internet, we've all, probably like traveled abroad, and we've seen life to a large extent. We've seen the world and we've interacted with many different cultures. Therefore, it becomes a very odd question for one to, or a very odd thing for one to note that, how could somebody just do what they're born into? Just because our world today is very different from back then. So we cannot use retrospective lens to judge the past. We have to use the lens of the past in order to judge the past. Of any era, of any period of time, in any geographical region, we have to use their cultural context to understand the society the way it worked back then. So if we are using the present to judge the past, it's going to be a huge problem. Because there are many things we do today which we did not do in the past. Like, for instance, today, many of our teachers even travel abroad. Pujya Swamiji goes abroad. He used to go abroad, sorry. He taught in Salisbury, Pennsylvania, which I've attended so many times. But in those days, Brahmins were not allowed to cross the sea. They were not allowed to travel abroad. And so these were rules which were applied then, they don't apply today. Some rules apply today which didn't apply then. So we have to judge every period of time based on the merits and demerits of that contemporary society, not of a different era. These people didn't have that because they didn't have time for these things. They were focused on their duties, and this was their upbringing. Today our upbringing is different, where people say, oh, you know what, beta, beti, whatever you want, you have a right to do whatever you want in life. You can grow up and dream and fulfill your dreams, which is fine. I am not even against that. But what I'm saying is that you can be a better karma yogi by looking at your actions as a duty as opposed to fighting for rights. Because the moment you even fight for rights, you're becoming the other. You're becoming a small individual. you're introducing multiple dualities into your life, because now you're seeing people as different. You're becoming competitive. You're becoming, you insecure as well. What do I do for a career? What do I do for my profession? See, back then, again, arranged marriages, love marriages, doesn't matter. I'm indifferent to both. My parents had a love marriage. I had an arranged marriage. Both work. Fine. So be it. Which is true, by the way. So what I'm really trying to express over here is, back then, people didn't even have issues about marriage. People got married, their kundalis were set, the parents agreed, life started, and then you beget children and you continue doing your dharma, whatever it is. Today people are like, oh, how do I get married? How do I find the right person? Kisko dhundu? Kaun theek hai? Kaun theek nahi? Kaun mere ko acha rakhega? Who will treat me nicely? All of these questions are there today, and we have to search. Just as we have to search for jobs, we have to even search for partners, and it's a very different world. Some ways it is better because we have better comforts and so on, but some ways it's not better. Some ways it's even worse. Today, this is how we are brought up. We are brought up to expect perfection out of every damn thing in the world. Whereas back then we focus on accommodating people. We focus on trying to suit our lives to fulfill the end goal of dharma and moksha. Today it's all about artha and kama. I know a friend, like, I'm not giving names here, but I know a friend who does not, who before getting married had issues with the guy staying with his parents, and she was about to like break up with the guy, not get married just because of that. The guy did not have an income to buy a separate house for himself. He made maybe 30,000-40,000 rupees a month. But the wise thing, the sensible thing would be to stay with the parents, because what if you're living in Bombay or Delhi, one of these places, you're not going to be able to buy a house with that salary or an apartment. You can't. It'll take you like 30-40 years of just saving up before you are. And so they got married, and problems happened. That's it. That's all I can say, because you are looking at it in terms of rights. I asked the person that, why don't you want to stay with the guy's parents? Are they bad or whatever? She's like, no, they're very good people. But I was brought up in a nuclear family. I did not stay with my grandparents. Therefore, I don't want my children to stay with their grandparents. What kind of logic is that? But this is the world we live in today, and we have to accept the realities that they were different in the past versus what they are today. So I guess we can come back to the topic, but I don't know if I've addressed Gunjanji's doubts here. It's just a different society. We still have some more ground to cover. Let's take a look at the other myth. Women were denied rights and education. The fact is, no, women were placed at par with men. There was no discrimination here. Sita Ma was depicted as chanting the Gayatri Mantra during her entrapment by Ravana in the Ashoka Vatika. And this presupposes initiation into the Upanyanam, right? Over here we see a picture. Ubhaya Bharati was a scholar of the Vedas, Jyotisha and dialectics. She presided over the debate of Adi Shankaracharya's debate with Mandana Mishra. And towards the end, she debated Shankaracharya himself. So here you can see in white over here, that's Ubhaya Bharati, Mandana Mishra's wife. And in order to preside over a debate, you obviously have to have the knowledge that both the participants have. If you are a judge of a debate, you have to probably be smarter than the participants as well, probably. So this showed the status of women in our society. We had rishis in the Vedas who were women. They are called rishikas. And Gargi was a formidable debater and scholar. This is a picture of Gargi debating Yajnavalkya in the court of the king. Here's a sample of rishikas from the Vedas. Maitreyi everybody knows. So again, we have women who were rishis, who were seers, just as the males were. People don't know this. People don't talk about it as well. And recall, ours is the only culture where we worship Ishvara in the masculine form, in the feminine form, as well as both. So this is Ardhanarishvara, right? You have, or especially the tantric traditions, if you see, you have Shiva and Shakti conflated together, or you have Vishnu and Lakshmi together. So we always worship Ishvara in pairs. We have not discriminated. In fact, it is the monotheistic societies. If you look at Islam, if you look at Christianity and Judaism, they are the ones who have only male prophets, and they are the ones who refer to God as He, which I find absurd, because I refer to God as he, she, it, both, everything. Whatever there is Ishvara. How can Ishvara have a gender? So we are a gender neutral society. We are the ones who respected men and women for both their roles. They had individual duties and different callings in life, and we respected both of these. And of course, as Pujya Swamiji often says, two of the most valued things in our culture, knowledge, which is Saraswati, and wealth, which is Lakshmi, are personified as women. What more evidence do we need? So, the myths that social evils are inherent in the fabric of India is really a myth. And the fact is that many of these are introduced and exacerbated by our conquerors. So, let's take a quick look at this. No society is perfect. India was no exception. But many, by no means all, of her problems were in large part introduced or exacerbated due to disruptions caused by invading forces. Let's see why. To give an example, Purva Paksha records by other traditions never indicate any evidence for discrimination between Varnas in Vedic society. Everybody is familiar with Purva Paksha debates between Shankara, between the Buddhists and the Purva Mimamsakas, the Samkhyavadis, and so on. There were no holds barred. Anything that they saw wrong with the other person's tradition, they would write about it and they would debate the person and they would definitely make sure that it's catalogued. But none of the records show that anybody has ever pointed fingers at Hindus and said that you guys discriminate between Varnas. It has never been done in the past. A Dharmika framework like us has zero sanction for adharma. There is no tolerance for adharma. Absolutely none. The first recorded incidences of criticism came only during the Bhakti era, which is around like 13th, 14th, 15th century, where the Mughal rule was already well established and Sikhism was still in its infancy. Sikhism was just being born around that period. And that is when the first instance of discrimination did take place. Now, here's why. With our attention and assets diverted towards stopping the repeated onslaughts of invasion, India was left in economic, intellectual, philosophical, and cultural ruin for a very long time, and we have still not recovered from it. For example, the Mughals, here's what they did. The upheaval in the Varna Vyavastha. Look, Mughals brought the Quran with them, they brought Islam with them, right? Obviously, they were Muslims. And therefore, the Brahmins were it was almost an antithesis to their way of thinking. And the first thing they did was displace the Brahmins, the Vedic scholars. We know for sure, there's no doubt about it, that they've destroyed tens of thousands of Hindu temples and Jain temples and so on. And so even the roles of Brahmins was highly diminished during the Mughal era. And the Kshatriyas in the top positions, not all the Kshatriyas, but the ones who were in the position of the king and so on, were also removed from their posts. And the Kshatriyas who were soldiers and all were employed by the Mughals. And so now when you displace one entire Varna, like the Brahmins and Kshatriyas partially, you displace them. Now there's going to be competition and all this backbiting and problems between the different Varnas, because Brahmins are now jobless for the most part. Some of them obviously sustained, and that's how we have our tradition today. But many of the Brahmins were completely dethroned from their position. And so what do? And that is when all these, Varna Sankaras took place, and what you call disruptions within the Varna society, within the Varna Vyavastha in our society. And this sowed seeds of bitterness between the Varnas. So this was the first instance. Let's take more examples here. So when you talk about child marriage, women were married off early in order to receive protection of the husband. Because this might sound like a very ugly fact, but the fact is that women were, the husbands were many times killed and women were raped by the Mughals, by the Muslims back then. I don't apologize for mentioning this. It's a fact that we need to know our past. And so many times the father would get the child married off quickly to the husband so that she's protected. Because if the woman is single, then she would be more susceptible to rapes and the older form of love jihad, as you would put it. Uneducated women, obviously, women stopped getting educated at that time because the above resulted in taking up family duty early without prioritizing your education. So once you're married and you're all into this household affair, where will you get educated? There's no time for it because all your resources are now towards, starting a family. Incidences of sati. Many women preferred ending their lives rather than face disgrace at the hands of their, attackers. They would not want to, lose their dignity, and this is why there were exacerbated incidences of sati. In fact, if you even talk about sati, people say, "Oh, there's a mention of the Mahabharata where Madri, right? She decided to immolate herself in the fire after she felt responsible for Pandu's death." But guess what? The people around her, including Kunti and others, asked her not to do that. They asked her that, please like reconsider your decision. But ultimately, they left it up to her that if she wishes to end her life, it's up to her. But they have also asked her to think twice about doing it. And so this is not something that, if your husband dies and you're supposed to push the wife into the fire as well. You're not supposed to do that. For example, we have a tradition in the Jain teachings called Sandhara, where if the Jains feel that they have lived up to their life's purpose and they don't want to continue further, or if there's a disease which they're not able to cure, then they stop eating food. Now, there was a huge Supreme Court judgment where they were debating about whether this is considered suicide, but it's not. The Jains say that why are you classifying us into the Western category of suicide? A person who is committing suicide is very depressed and they don't know what to do with their lives and they end their lives out of misery. Whereas the Jains who are committing their lives is out of willfulness. They believe that, I've lived up to my purpose or whatever I want to accomplish now, and there's nothing much to look forward to, or maybe there's a predicament that they cannot get out of. And rather than face all these horrific treatments in hospital, chemotherapy and all, they may choose to end their lives in a dignified way, perhaps, by being at the bedside with their loved ones and their family and so on. Or it could even be something that they're doing for their religion. It could be their form of Prayaschitta, or it could be some kind of upasana for them. We don't know. We cannot judge that. We cannot judge ourselves using Western standards such as suicide and so on. So this is what I'm trying to say. Sati was not ever encouraged in our society. But over here, many women prefer to end their lives than to face disgrace at the hands of their attackers. Now the Britishers, they made it even worse. As much as I criticize the Mughals, the Britishers were 1,000 times worse. They actually, see, when the Mughals invaded India, the wealth that remained stayed in India, right? Because they did not take it back to them, to the Arab countries or to Mongolia, where some of them came from. But when the Britishers came to India, they siphoned all our wealth away to Britain. And so both of them were invaders, but the Britishers had a worse legacy. And they were also very smart. They implemented the divide and rule policy to great effect. So on census documents, they forced Brahmins to classify themselves as upper caste and Shudras as lower caste. Remember, we had no such connotations of inferiority or superiority in our Varnas, but the Britishers forced Brahmins to call themselves upper caste. And therefore, you've already created a dichotomy in society of upper and lower, and now Varnas are going to feel discriminated. And so after many generations, of course, Brahmins are going to feel that they are upper caste, and Shudras are going to feel they are lower caste, because this is what the Britishers have fed them. Very important to understand. This is not in our tradition, this is what the Britishers fed. And that is why today also I was appalled, because when I was looking to get married about more than 2 years ago, when I went to Bharat Matrimony and all of these other matrimonial sites, people would write on their profile that I'm looking for upper caste boy or upper caste girl. This is absurd. I thought, how can you even classify people as upper and lower? But we have to thank the Britishers for this. And this is how they manufactured acrimony, by imposing false inferiority or superiority between Varnas. So any questions here? We'll probably take another 10 minutes before we close.
How come it came then untouchability and all? That was much before British times.
Okay, so the untouchability, what we talk about, is not the same as the Dalits we have today. Now, back then, you had a system where if there's a person who's a criminal, they were removed from your Varna Vyavastha. Do you see what I'm saying? The Varna Vyavastha is a social order which accommodated the 4 Varnas. Today, what do? We throw people in jail. Okay? If a person's smoking weed or whatever, they're drunk driving, we throw them in jail and we distance them from our society. Is that not true? Jail is a way to distance people from our society when they're criminals. Back then, we distanced people by removing them from the Varna Vyavastha. We got rid of their label as either a Brahmin or as a Kshatriya or a Vaishya or a Shudra. They were no longer part of the Varna Vyavastha, and that is our way of distancing them from society for committing whatever crime they have committed. And that is not the same as untouchability. In fact, they simply formed their own community somewhere else, and they stayed away from the rest of society, so they would not create problems for us. But now, over time, yes, you're right about that many people look down upon them. But let's face it, today, if you are looking to get married and some boy's father has been to jail, would you marry the son?
No, times that people were not touching the people who
Yes.
were doing menial work, I may say so. I agree with you that
No,
one
no, no,
wants
no.
to
I will
remain
disagree
in the
about the
same
menial work.
society.
There was no work that we considered menial.
No,
Untouchable.
what I meant is, yeah, I used a wrong word, but what I meant was, okay, somehow it was like they were lower caste even before Britishers.
We
This
don't
was
accept the caste
maybe the
system.
feeling.
So let's go back over here.
Okay.
In fact, when we look at the fact where we say they were often introduced or exacerbated. So what you were talking about is a case where it was exacerbated. So the problem was made worse by the imposition of upper and lower by the Britishers. Like I said, the problem always existed. Like, as mentioned here, no society is perfect. India was no exception. But
Yeah.
not all of our problems were, inherent to India. Many of them were introduced or exacerbated due to the disruptions. So now we have an example of Shankaracharya's life. He comes across a Chandala who was considered back then untouchable. You're right about that. And so Shankara says, keep away from me, stay away from me, don't I don't want to touch you. And the Chandala is actually Lord Shiva in disguise, coming to teach Shankara a lesson. And Shankara knows it, but it is a way for him to teach others a lesson by example. And so the Chandala says, okay, you want me to move away. Who should move away? Should my body move away? Because my body, which is made of the same Prithvi element, is the same as your body. So if my body is impure, your body is also impure because we are made of the same elements, right?
Yeah.
And the second question he's asking Shankara is, if it is my body you want me to move away, then we are made of the same elements. Or do you want my Atma to move away? But then he says there is only Atma. There is not one Atma, two Atma, three Atma. There is only Atma. And therefore, if you want my Atma to move away, how is that possible? So whom should you want to move away? And you know what Shankara does? He touches the Chandala's feet. Shankara, a Brahmin, touches the Chandala's feet to set an example in society. And then he says that whoever teaches me the knowledge of myself, the nature of reality, the fact of who I am, is my teacher, whether he's a Brahmana or a Chandala or whoever else. But one has to understand that the Chandala is not the same as Shudra. This is what the Britishers have done. The Britishers made Shudra as the lower caste, whereas Shudra still belonged to the Varna Vyavastha. The Chandalas and all did not. So this was an example Shankara said for us, and he composed a work called Manisha Panchakam. Manisha Panchakam is in praise of the Atma based on the teaching of the Chandala. So it's beautiful. So yes,
Okay, thank you.
thank you. Who is this, by the way?
I'm Meera Berry. I'm
Okay,
on your Facebook.
Yeah,
I live
yeah,
in Germany.
I see. Yeah, we've spoken before.
Okay.
Nice to see you here. So these are the grand myths. Vedic tradition is full of social evils. We discriminate against women, child marriage, caste system, and sati. All right, so myths busted. And let's cover the last few quickly. Mahabharata and Ramayana are myths. That's
I
a
don't
myth.
know why
Oh, sorry.
it gets muted by me. I'm saying I'm sorry.
Sorry?
I'm sorry.
Okay. So I didn't follow, but okay. Mahabharata and Ramayana are myths is a myth. The fact is, itihasas describe historical events. So itihasas come from itihasa. So it indeed was. The foundations of itihasas are historical. They were written down in the form of poetry. Every poet has the freedom to exercise some poetic liberty. Imagine reading the 100,000 verses contained in the Mahabharata as as factual retelling. It would be very humdrum and boring. You could not stand it. You can hardly read 100 verses of just pure fact. Imagine 100,000 verses. And so the overstatements and the exaggerations that are contained in these itihasas are not facetious at all, because facts, when interspersed with elements of magic and marvel, turn history into the stuff of legends, enriching the individual's imagination and adding to the collective cultural symbolism. So it is because the poet Valmiki or Ved Vyasa or whoever you talk about have taken the liberty to turn these epics, the historical teachings, into poetry. That is what gives rise to all the cultural symbolisms we have today. Today even in our culture we still retell many stories from the Mahabharata and Ramayana, right? We name people after the characters and so on. So Literally everything in our culture, I would argue today, almost everything, 99% of it, would be derived from two sources: the Itihasas and the Puranas. The Upanishads are, of course, lofty statements of truths, but you cannot have too much culture coming out of pure truth unless there is some symbolism attributed upon it or superimposed upon it. You need that symbolism, you need that storytelling, you need the grandiose of these colorful names and forms and characters and history and stories and so on. So you require these things, and that is what itihasas are. They are historical retellings with a lot of interspersed magic and poetry. So, Puja Swamiji often says Ravana did not have 10 heads, literally. He had 10 conflicting personalities. 10 stands for many. So, for example, he was a son of a Brahmin. He was a grandson of the great sage Pulastya, the Vedic Rishi. He played the role of a Kshatriya. He had the attributes of a Rakshasa because he was also a Rakshasa. And he was a scholar of the Vedas, and yet he violated every single thing that you could think of. And so he was such a conflicted personality that you had these 10 heads all talking to each other, trying to see who's going to win, who's going to make the decision. There was one head of Ravana which was a good head as well. It was a good head, and it would always say the right things, but the evil head would always dominate. And ultimately, the decisions would be made by the evil head. So this is what the 10 heads of Ravana symbolizes: multiple split personality and his variegated facets. So this is what we understand as itihasas. Mahabharata is traditionally dated to 3100 BC, so that's about 5000 years ago, though many scholars converge between 900 to 1400 BCE. And of course, Ramayana is even older than the Mahabharata. There is enough evidence, archaeological, astronomical, etc., for historically verifying the itihasas, but the scope of our presentation does not allow us to get into these details. Therefore, I leave it up to the reader or the listener to research. Other common myths, let's just breeze through a few because we are coming to a close now. Let's have some fun as well. Hindus worship 330 million gods. That's a myth. And the fact is, what are gods? What do we even mean by gods? We have witnessed the dangers of mistranslating and expressing our ideas using Abrahamic contextualization. Let's look at it differently. There is only Ishvara. Not one, not two, not many, but only Ishvara. There are 7.2 billion self-conscious beings on Earth alone, humans, self-conscious beings, with the exclusion of, say, Rahul Gandhi. There are more microscopic organisms in the intestines of a single human being than there are humans on this planet. There are more creatures living in your gut than there are all humans on this planet. And countlessly more star systems in space which abound with life in our universe. Out of these descriptions, about 330 million or 33 crores are beings with superior upadhis to us. They are, superior in terms of their physicality, their minds, and so on. And these are the people we refer to as devas. These are jivas only. They are individuals like us, but they are superior to us in some ways. So therefore, we call them devas. So when the Westerner says that you Hindus worship 330 million gods, what does it mean? And this is why the lower G and the upper G business adds confusion. And I refuse to, follow that. Because the Christians have come up with this tradition, right? That their God is with the upper G, whereas every other gods, like the pagans worshipped, or the Greeks worshipped, or the Romans worshipped, or whatever, was given a lower G. It's almost like disrespectful. And plus it adds confusion because gods and all, whereas we have Ishvara, Devas, Brahman, all these like different concepts are there. So we should follow our tradition and our style, not the Western connotations. Myth. The Bhagavad Gita preaches violence. The fact is, no, that's rubbish. It is a yoga shastra and a moksha shastra. So here's a quote by Wendy Doniger. If you don't know her, well, it's a good thing. The Bhagavad Gita is not as nice a book as some Americans think. Throughout the Mahabharata, Krishna goads human beings into all sorts of murderous and self-destructive behaviors, such as war. The Gita is a dishonest book. Suggestion. You should study the Bhagavad Gita or any text for that matter under a sampradaya with Guru. A sampradaya with Guru. That's the key over here. And secondary suggestion. First and foremost, prioritize an appointment with a psychoanalyst. It would save us a lot of trouble. Because honestly, Wendy Doniger is one of those people who have created a sexualized Freudian account of our teachings. And we need to move away from this and we need to establish it as pure fiction. Yeah, that's funny. Myth. The Gita is the Bible of Hindus. The fact is no. The Gita is the Gita for Hindus. What does it mean to call it the Bible of Hindus? Firstly, unlike the monotheistic faiths, we have a vast corpus of Shastras. The Gita is one of them. But I wish to make a more important point here. Don't we do this all the time? The Gita is the Bible of Hindus. Kashmir is the Switzerland of India. Kalidas is the Shakespeare of India. Bollywood, Tollywood couldn't even imaginatively come up with their own names, and they had to rip theirs off of Hollywood. So what next? And then after flooding is the Venice of India, like when do we need to stop this kind of thing? Can't we have our own identity without being condescendingly patronized or compared to as equivalents or inferiors of the West? Can't we really for once, step up and say that, sorry, let's compare the West to us. Let's not compare ourselves to the West. We need to do that. We need to take stock in our own selves. So that's all. Well, not really. So the Purva Pakshi says, why are we stopping here? According to my calculations, we still have 326 something billion more misconceptions to cover. So the Uttara is, as per my revised calculations, we have even more than that to cover. But the good news is only a handful are enough to get the gist and direct our thinking to addressing the rest as they may arise, which hopefully now we are all more equipped to do. So obviously there are so many more that are still lying out there for us to cover, which we cannot for the scope of this session. But once we've learned the right way to think and to analyze problems, we can always do it to the rest as well. The Purva Pakshi says, or asks, how then does one discriminate between eternal versus non-eternal, right versus wrong, sense versus nonsense? Among all the attributes of a thinking being, Vivekaha is the most prized. For Vedanta, one requires Nitya Vastu Vivekaha, which is to know the difference between eternal and non-eternal. And for Veda Purvaha, we focus on Dharma Vivekaha, which is to know what is Dharma versus Adharma. And the ways to develop this, being accustomed to the teachings and methodologies of one's gurus, partaking in the wisdom of our elders and the family traditions our ancestors have set for us, digging deeper into our cultural symbolisms, knowing what they stand for, how they arise and where they apply, studying the Itihasas and Puranas, forming an understanding of the archetypal characters and their attributes, emulating their goodness while avoiding the errors they committed. All of these go a long way into cultivating Vivekaha. And so here are a few closing notes. Ishvara has gifted the mind with durability and tenacity. We can mold it to suit our needs. With time and effort, clarity cannot help but dawn. Following that, it is up to each and every Hindu to take up the charge and advance these dialogues with their families, friends, and create a wider satsanga. So that would be my request to all of us, that we can talk about this to any length, between ourselves, but it would just be preaching to the choir because we are all on the path already. But it's good to share this knowledge and wisdom with others who are not familiar with these teachings, as well as who have a lot of misconceptions about us the way Westerners do. And so it's good to take this dialogue ahead with them. And so on that note, I'll close off with a Shanti Mantra, and we can take a few last, questions or comments. Om Purnamadah Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Harihi Om. Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Harihi Om. Okay, so any last comments? I'll just stop broadcasting.